to show you how to roll a porcelain slab. I'm going to show you how to create a little porcelain plate or tray, as well as a very simple porcelain vase. You're going to need a little bit of water and a sponge. If you do not have your mud sponge, which is often what we use in the studio, you can cut a little piece off of another sponge to use for this refining process, because you do want to make sure that your sponge is very clean and completely devoid of stoneware or any other clay body other than the porcelain. So either thoroughly rinse your mud sponge or cut off a little section of another sponge that you have around the house. You will also need a rib, and you have a little piece of fresh, clean canvas that will be just for porcelain use. So I'm going to direct the camera down so you can see what I'm doing. You will need your PVC pipe also for this process, or if you do not have a PVC pipe, then you can use a rolling pin that you have around the house. Remember that if your porcelain clay is a little too stiff, to add a little bit of water to your Ziploc bag and allow that clay, give it a little bit of time to absorb that moisture, and then your porcelain will be workable again. So I'm going to take a small ball of porcelain clay, larger than a golf ball, but smaller than a tennis ball. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to just punch it and slam it into that canvas, and I'm going to flip and do the same on the other side. This will really expedite that rolling process. It looks like somehow I ended up with a little paintbrush hair in the porcelain. That's no big deal, that will burn right out in the kiln. You want to make sure that rolling pin is clean. Hold on to the canvas and just press and roll that porcelain nice and thin. Periodically, take your porcelain, pick up the canvas as well, peel the porcelain off, flip the porcelain over, and continue to roll. Just like when you're stretching dough, rolling out dough for a batch of cookies, the porcelain is going to roll out a lot faster if you release it from the canvas that you're pressing it into and flip it over. It will then roll a lot quicker. Remember, you can really push porcelain quite thin, so take the time to get that porcelain rolled nice and thin. Test what it is capable of, because for this first form, we're just going to do a very simple plate. Check out how thin that porcelain is already getting. That is looking really good. We have edges cracking, that's no big deal. We'll be refining later. So you can go ahead and check that out. Nice and thin. I'm going to flip it over again. Continue to roll. Yes, I am pushing this very thin. So now I'm ready to shape my plate. You can see I have a split right over there. I'm going to clean up these edges with a very nice, clean, rinsed cleanup tool. Rather than taking a sponge and trying to refine, especially that very large crack area, it's going to be a lot cleaner and a lot quicker to use a wet cleanup tool. Again, make sure you've rinsed off your cleanup tool and that there's no stoneware on it. So I'm going to take this cleanup tool and just cut a nice clean edge on this plate the whole way around. Keep that tool wet so that it does not accidentally snag that dry porcelain. Porcelain is naturally a little bit drier, a little bit stiffer when we work with it. So now I can remove that ring, and then I will be ready to refine with a wet sponge. So I've chosen to cut a nice organic, very natural shape. So I'm going to go back in with my sponge and I'm going to refine the edges. It looks as though I really do not need to even use the rib on the surface. I'm just going to get rid of that canvas texture with my sponge. Do not leave that canvas texture in there. Take the time to really smooth and refine the porcelain so that you get that nice satiny finish that is so natural to porcelain. If you end up with gouges somehow or indents in the porcelain when you're rolling it, that's when your rib tool will come in very handy. You want to use the flat side, glide it dry across the porcelain, and that will smooth that area. So now I have a very flat form. I want to create more of a natural plate. So I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to create a very natural curve or loop under that edge so that now I can actually pick up this little plate that would likely be used for something small like cookies or cake or even a roll of sushi, all right? So I want to really take the time to clean up these edges and any visible areas that are uneven or sloppy. You then want to cover this piece of slab with a piece of plastic so that it can dry very slowly. You can leave it on the canvas. The canvas will draw the moisture out, but the bag will still allow it to dry evenly. Having even drying for porcelain is vital. So you still want to make sure you slow down that drying process, otherwise your edges will dry super quickly and your center will remain leather hard, and then you'll have cracking. If your porcelain is super soft, you are going to need to leave it covered for a little while before pressing your signature stamp in. My porcelain clay, however, is a little bit on the stiff side, so I can go ahead and get that signature stamp pressed into the form. Now I would like to show you how to create a very simple porcelain slab vase. You are going to need a small ball of clay and then about a golf ball size ball of clay. This is going to become the base of your vase and this will be the wall. You want to make sure that your clay is soft enough to roll out without considerable cracking, so make sure that you add moisture to your Ziploc bag in advance if you need to. So I'm going to go ahead and start with rolling out the base. I'm going to tuck this extra ball of clay away in plastic so it does not literally stiffen while I speak. So I'm going to flatten out that form a little bit with punching it, and then I'm going to roll and flip the clay. You want to make sure that when you're doing this that your canvas is dry. If your canvas contains a lot of moisture, your porcelain will stick. You can see that a little tiny clay goober stuck to the rolling pin. Make sure you get rid of that, otherwise it will add an unwanted texture to the surface of your porcelain. Do not be deterred by your porcelain sticking to the rolling pin. Just gently peel it away and continue to roll with perhaps a little less pressure. So I'm going to flip and rotate and continue to roll. So now I have the base to my vase. The base to the vase can be ever so slightly than the wall thickness, but it still should be less than 1/4 inch. So now I'm going to work on the wall of the base. So I have my larger ball of clay. I'm going to again start by pounding it flat, flip it over, give it another little pound, and flip. Now I can roll. Checking to make sure I don't have any clay goobers stuck there. And I'm going to roll. Flatten out that clay to a nice, thin wall thickness. You might need this porcelain to be ever so slightly thicker than what we got away with the plate, because it is going to be vertical. Rather than have the support of the table surface, it is going to need to stand upright. Now I have my vase wall. So I'm going to cut what will be a flat bottom edge of that vase form. So I'm just going to take my cleanup tool wet and quickly cut the base of the vase. Then I'm going to clean up my edges a little bit by using my cleanup wheel or cleanup tool and clean up those edges. Remove that scrap clay. And start your refining process. You're going to need your sponge for this. Get those edges refined and gradually remove that canvas texture. you're going to want this side to be the outside of the vase, since it's the side that you're taking a little bit more time to refine. So now I'm going to take my vase wall, take a little bit of time to curl it into that vase shape that I would like. This. And I'm going to hold it up to the base. I can actually get several vase bases out of that piece of clay. So now I'm going to take my cleanup tool and I'm just going to quickly mark where that base is. Set my wall aside, cut out my base a little tiny bit larger than the outline because I'll use some of that clay to overlap the edges. Now you're going to take the curved side of your cleanup tool or your cross-hatching tool and you can cross-hatch very quickly because you do not want this porcelain drying out, so you want a nice quick assembly, nice deep cross-hatching on both parts. Dip this very quickly, just the tiny edge in and out of water, that is your slip, and press on your base. So now I have a sloppy bottom edge. You want to take a dry rib tool and clean up your bottom edge. When you first clean up the bottom edge, it is going to be a little sloppy in appearance. Give the porcelain just a couple minutes to dry after you do that initial smoothing out of the form, and you'll see that it'll be much easier to continue to refine. So that bottom edge is still a bit sloppy, so I'm going to go back in there with a wet sponge and finish refining after the porcelain is a little bit stiffer. But we have a beautiful overlap of the vase form. This is not cross-hatched, we're just pressing it together and having that slight separation of the form becomes very decorative. So I want to show you my finished slab porcelain forms. I have a very basic little slab plate here, and I have stamped my initial using that signature stamp in the base, and I have some curved edges, which makes it nice and easy to pick up. So this is actually bone dry and ready to fire. You may want to consider transporting this wrapped in bubble wrap if it's going to be completely dry. Or if you transport it leather hard, you can always do some refining after it arrives back in the studio. Another example I have completed is my very basic porcelain slab vase. You can now do this on a larger scale once you've played around with a smaller scale. After that base and that attachment stiffened up, you can see that I smoothed and refined the edges. But one thing that makes porcelain very different from stoneware is you really want to do your smoothing and refining when it's a little bit stiffer. In fact, porcelain, unlike stoneware, is really easy to refine with a wet sponge even after it has dried out. You just have to be very careful because it will break easily. I want you to pay close attention to wall thickness. Remember, porcelain is something you should be pushing very thin. It has the capability to go quite thin and have that translucent quality to it, which is what we're going for. So I want to see you create a plate form and a vase form from Porcelain Slab.